At the beginning of the Second World War, Hitler's command plans were truly global. In 1940, they intended to carry out the ambitious Operation Sea Lion, which envisioned a landing on the British Isles. However, the invasion did not take place within the planned timeframe, though the German strategists were not going to abandon it completely. To ensure success in this new grand undertaking, the idea arose to deliver not only personnel across the Channel in the first wave, but also heavy weaponry. By that time, they had already gained positive experience in using cargo gliders during airborne operations. On October 12, 1940, the Imperial Ministry of Aviation announced a competition to create a heavy assault glider. The list of cargoes the glider was to carry included Type 3 and Type 4 tanks, assault guns, anti-aircraft guns, track tractors, as well as 200 infantrymen with full equipment. The requirement specified simplicity of construction, since the glider was essentially disposable. Interestingly, even before the competition was concluded, the participating firms received orders to prepare the production base for building 100 units. The deadlines were extremely tight. The preliminary design had to be presented by November 1, 1940. From the very beginning, it was decided to involve the well-known aircraft manufacturing firms Junkers and Messerschmitt. The first firm's project received the designation Warsaw East, while the second was Warsaw South. Before moving on to the main subject of this article, it is necessary to say a few words about its competitor developed by the Junkers firm. The Junkers design department working on the glider was located in the city of Merseburg. The project was supervised by Professor Heinrich Hertel, engineers Groppler and Paul Johann Gall. At first, the glider was named Goliath, and from November 1940, it was called Mammoth. As a starting point, they used a Junkers transport aircraft, in which most of the useful load was placed in the wing. The requirement to use cheap materials in the construction played a cruel joke on the Mammoth, and possibly doomed the project altogether. Junkers was tasked with building the glider mainly from wood, although the firm's designers, accustomed to working with metal, practically had no experience with this material. Problems arose immediately. The first calculations showed that the mass of the wooden spar would account for 1.8% of the total mass of the glider. Nevertheless, they managed to build an experimental spar that weighed half as much, though in static tests it broke under an overload of only 1.1 units. The Mammoth fully lived up to its name. Like the mighty prehistoric beast, it looked majestic and somewhat clumsy. The aircraft had a wingspan of 203 feet and a length of 97 feet. It could carry 44,000 pounds of cargo, placed in the developed center section, whose leading edge was removable to allow loading and unloading. For takeoff, it was decided to use a jettisonable trolley. Variants with 8, 16, and 32 wheels mounted on a steel tube frame were studied. This landing gear weighed 1,700 pounds. When dropped from a height of 7 to 16 feet, there was a risk of damaging the glider due to the trolley bouncing off the ground, while from a greater height, the trolley itself could be destroyed. Production of 30 gliders began immediately, and materials were accumulated for 70 more. When the first prototype was more or less ready, they decided to test the useful load. A Type 4 tank drove into the cargo cabin via a special ramp, and the floor collapsed under its tracks. After repairs and reinforcement, the empty weight of the glider increased by 8,800 pounds, reducing the payload to 35,200 pounds. Experts believed further modifications would be necessary, and as a result, the payload would hardly exceed 26,400 pounds. The next problem arose when choosing a tow aircraft capable of pulling such a large glider. From the very limited circle of candidates, a 4-engine Junkers with engines of 898 horsepower each was selected. With its help, in April 1941, they attempted to send the repaired Mammoth on its first flight. With the glider attached on a 394-foot cable, the tow plane barely gained speed, though its engines roared at full throttle. Eventually, it lifted into the air, while the Mammoth continued to roll along the ground, only lifting off at the very edge of the airfield. The trolley was immediately jettisoned and shattered on impact. Relieved of 1,700 unnecessary pounds, the glider surged upward. And then the trouble began. The glider proved unstable in flight, and the pilots had to work hard to dampen the oscillations. The tow plane began swaying behind it as well. The flight became dangerous, and at low altitude, the cable had to be released. The pilots landed the glider straight ahead on the first suitable field, during which the Mammoth sustained damage. During repairs, the machine was modified by enlarging the fin and stabilizer. Another attempt was made to get it airborne, but again unsuccessfully. The Mammoth remained unstable in flight. Such disappointing results led the technical directorate to decide to close the Warsaw East project. The two built Mammoths, as well as those under construction, were dismantled into firewood, which was used as fuel for trucks with gas generator engines. In total, these high-quality logs cost the Reich 45 million marks. A week after the preliminary designs were submitted, both firms received instructions from the ministry to immediately start the program. This further accelerated the pace of work. The Warsaw South program was developed under the concept of Professor Willy Messerschmitt. The project site was chosen in the town of Leifheim, where one of Messerschmitt's factories was located. The local work was led by engineer Josef Fröhlich. In parallel with the design, materials were accumulated and production preparations were carried out. At first, this glider was named Me 263, but on February 1, 1941, it was renamed Me 321 with the individual name Giant. Unlike its competitors, its construction made wide use of steel, which had a very positive effect on the final result. The glider was built according to a classical scheme with a high-mounted wing. The cargo cabin had a length of about 36 feet, a maximum width of 10.3 feet, and a height of 10.8 feet. Mounts were installed in the frame and floor to secure cargo with a total weight of 44,000 pounds, with overload up to 48,400 pounds. No lifting devices were provided, as it was assumed that loading the equipment would be carried out by the landing troops themselves. Numerous windows were made along the sides, and some had openings through which paratroopers could fire their standard machine guns. A characteristic feature of the glider was the design of the nose section of the fuselage, which consisted of double cargo doors opening to the sides. Such doors were invented by the Messerschmitt Company and were later used on several transport aircraft of Western firms. Another original structural feature of the Giant was hidden under the wing skin. Its load-bearing structure was based on a large spatial frame welded from steel tubes, which occupied more than 1/3 of the wing's internal volume. Known sources call this rather exotic element the main spar, although it is not, since it absorbed not only the bending and shear typical of a spar, but also torsion. For landing, the glider was equipped with 4 steel skis, and to protect the tail from impacts, a tail skid was installed. For takeoff, a jettisonable landing gear was chosen, consisting of 4 wheels. 2 of them, with a diameter of 5.2 feet, had a common axle and were attached to the main skis, while smaller diameter wheels were mounted on special brackets on the front skis. The front wheels could turn within limits, increasing the glider's maneuverability on the ground. Immediately after takeoff, the wheel gear weighing 2,640 pounds was dropped and could be reused. Such takeoff and landing devices were quite acceptable for a one-time use glider. But when daily operation began, it became clear that the Giant was practically helpless on the ground. Mounting it on wheels was a very laborious and complex procedure. First, the tail was loaded so that the nose lifted up and wheels were placed under the front skis. Then the load was removed and jacks were placed under the tail section, lifting the glider and bringing wheels under the main skis. The crew of the glider consisted of a pilot, a radio operator, and the so-called loadmaster, who was responsible for loading and unloading the glider, maintaining acceptable balance, and jettisoning the landing gear after takeoff. The pilot and radio operator were located in the cockpit above the fuselage, while the loadmaster was in the cargo cabin. Construction of the first prototype glider took 3 months. Like their competitors at Junkers, Messerschmitt specialists had to use the June 90 aircraft as a tug, which could tow the Giant only with partial load. Later, this problem was solved by equipping the aircraft with more powerful BMW 139 engines of 1,550 horsepower each. On February 25, 1941, the Giant took to the air for the first time. The flight ended quite successfully. Later, a box with 8,800 pounds of bricks was loaded into the glider, and the tests continued. Since everything was being done in great haste, no developed test program existed, and each flight was carried out with a large share of improvisation. The Giant was piloted by experienced glider pilots known since pre-war times, including Otto Brodegem, Erwin Kraft, and Alfred Room. They noted that the aircraft had good stability and controllability, and that landing posed no difficulties. The only drawback they considered was the great physical effort required to control the huge glider. Regular Messerschmitt company pilots gave less favorable reviews, but this can be explained by the fact that they had flown only airplanes before. In any case, the first flights confirmed the correctness of the chosen concept, and the glider received a recommendation for mass production. For further tests, the glider was transferred to the control of the Luftwaffe High Command, which organized a special department, Leipheim. It coordinated all work and provided training for glider pilots. At the same time, a school was established in Echterdingen to train towing aircraft pilots. Meanwhile, construction began on 11 gliders of the first series. Materials were also ordered for the next 62 units. To cope with such a large product, the company organized extensive cooperation. The Komotau plant manufactured fuselages and wing frames. Wing ribs and other wooden parts were produced by the Me company in Stuttgart. Several more factories manufactured the remaining assemblies, which, under the cover designation high-voltage equipment for secrecy, were delivered to Messerschmitt plants in Leipheim and Obertraubling, where final assembly was carried out. It should be noted that the design was constantly improved, so even gliders of the same series differed slightly from one another. After test flights, all Giants were collected in Leipheim for transfer to the Luftwaffe. Overall, the Me 321 met military requirements. It could carry a gun, a light tank, or 200 soldiers. Its cabin could accommodate 2 disassembled Bf-109 fighters. By the end of summer 1941, 100 of these gliders had been built. During operation, it became clear that the small number of heavy Junkers, 90 tow planes, was insufficient to lift the huge, giant gliders into the air. After long debates, the Germans decided to try towing the glider with 3 Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighters at once, each with powerful 100-horsepower engines. The central aircraft was connected to the glider with a 10mm cable 330 feet long, and the 2 side aircraft with cables 260 feet long. This method was called Troika, in honor of the well-known Russian horse harness. However, even this method did not allow the glider to lift off with maximum load, and a very long takeoff run was required. No less than 4,000 feet, which was considered an enormous distance for those times. The Giant left the ground at about 56 miles per hour. Normally, it was first blown to the right, then took up a position behind the central tug. Immediately after takeoff, the fighter pilots had to exert immense effort to keep their aircraft in formation. Climb was performed at about 81 miles per hour amid constant jerks on the tow ropes and the danger of the tugs entering a spin. Only when the air train transitioned to horizontal flight and accelerated to 124 miles per hour did the situation become more or less calm, provided, of course, that they did not encounter zones of atmospheric turbulence. To increase the system's power during takeoff, the Germans decided to use rocket-assisted takeoff units of the Girat type. Structurally, the booster was a streamlined capsule containing a spherical tank of hydrogen peroxide, a container of sodium permanganate, air bottles, launching and control equipment, and an engine. A parachute was attached to the front of the capsule so that the booster could descend to the ground after being jettisoned from the glider, allowing it to be reused many times. The booster engine operated on the so-called cold cycle. Hydrogen peroxide decomposed under the action of sodium permanganate with heat release. The resulting steam gas was expelled through a nozzle, producing 1,100 pounds of thrust for 30 seconds. Pilots of the highest qualification were required to fly the Troika, but even they sometimes failed to avoid accidents and disasters, a whole series of which occurred during various tests. The first victims were lost while practicing fighter takeoffs with joined tow ropes, but without the glider. The right aircraft unexpectedly dived to the left and struck the lead's rope. Both aircraft crashed. Soon, during a takeoff with the Giant in tow, one rope snapped. A catastrophe was avoided only thanks to the skill of Room, who was piloting the glider. He immediately disconnected, activated unused starting boosters, then put the Giant into a very steep turn, rolled it out, barely grazing the ground with a wing, and landed safely. In another flight, the release occurred at 1,300 feet. The glider began a turn, but one of the ropes did not release, and as a result, the tug lost its tail. 2 more fighters collided during a start after the boosters suspended from one wing of the Giant failed to ignite. Brodegum was also unlucky. He crashed while practicing a maximum mass takeoff when ballast shifted. But the most tragic accident occurred during one of the first test flights with a paratroop load. Again, the boosters on one side failed, whereupon the glider yawed to the side, all the tugs collided and fell into the forest, and the Giant immediately followed. 120 paratroopers and 9 crew members were killed. It was the largest air disaster of World War II. Despite such losses, the Germans were forced to use the Troika for quite some time, although they were constantly searching for other tug options. The use of the Junkers 290, which had more powerful engines than the Junkers 90, seemed promising. But there were very few such machines, and they still could not provide takeoff for the Messerschmitt 321 at full load. In the end, it was necessary to create a special tug, the Heinkel Twin. It was produced by joining 2 Heinkel 111 bombers using specially designed wing and stabilizer sections, and by installing a 5th engine on the aircraft's center line. The total power of the aircraft's power plant reached 6750 horsepower. Controlling this monster was not easy, but it could enable the Giant to take off fully loaded. A total of 12 twins were built. In parallel with refining the main glider model, development of a second variant proceeded. On the new machine, the area of aerodynamic balance on the control surfaces was increased, and the transmission ratios in the control system wiring were adjusted, which made it possible to somewhat reduce the load on the control organs. The enlarged crew cabin accommodated 2 pilots side by side, and behind them a radio operator. 2 machine guns were installed in the windows of the lower part of the cargo door. A second armament option was also developed using the same machine guns mounted in the upper part of the cargo door. In that case, the gunners were suspended on special harnesses. The armament mounted in the nose section was of little use for defending the glider in flight, but it could prove handy when landing on a position occupied by the enemy. The new glider entered series production. Some examples of this modification had the first armament option, some the second, and later ones both. By the end of 1941, 86 such gliders had been produced and another 14 in early 1942. As production of the Giant gliders continued, they were assembled at the Lapim airfield, from where they were planned to be transferred to France. But due to a change in command plans, it was decided to use them in the campaign against the Soviet Union. The first group of heavy gliders was formed in April-May 1941. It included 4 squadrons, each with 6 Giants, as well as 4 squadrons of tug aircraft. After the start of the war with the USSR, the table of organization was changed. Now one unit included 5 gliders and 15 tugs. Each squadron had a special detachment that serviced the starting boosters. This required particular caution from personnel because the rocket fuel components were poisonous and prone to spontaneous ignition. For combat operations, the squadrons were assigned to different sectors of the front. The 1st Towing Squadron of Giants, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Meltzer, was sent to the northern front. The 22nd Squadron under Senior Lieutenant Schaefer to the center, the 4th Squadron of Senior Lieutenant Pohl to the south. In addition, the 2nd Squadron of Senior Lieutenant Baumann was kept in reserve. Difficulties arose already at the stage of deployment to forward airfields. Reaching them without intermediate landings proved impossible, since the towing duration did not exceed 2 hours, during which no more than 250 miles could be covered. Preparation for another flight required much effort and time. The Giants carried with them the necessary tractors, jacks, various devices, and tools, while wheels for the landing gear and boosters had to be delivered by transport aircraft. Moreover, triple aircraft towing was possible only during the day and in good weather. Due to frequent malfunctions, unscheduled landings occurred on unprepared sites from where evacuation of the gliders was carried out by Captain Gumich with an aircraft. But be that as it may, the 1st Squadron reached Riga, the 22nd reached Orsha, and the 4th reached Vinnytsia. Only the 1st Squadron had to take part in airborne operations, for which the Giant had originally been created. The gliders were used in the battles for the Moonsund Archipelago in the Baltic Sea. On September 14, 1941, a group of gliders delivered paratroopers to Saaremaa Island during an unsuccessful attempt to capture the 43rd Coastal Battery at Cape Kubasari. As Meltzer recalled, the gliders landed not at the position of the Soviet battery but north of it. The unsuccessful landing and the delayed disembarkation on the shore caused the failure of the operation. The attack from the sea was repelled, the airborne troops were surrounded, and only on September 15th were the men evacuated in inflatable boats. When the Germans nevertheless captured Moonsund, the gliders flying from Estonian territory, supplied the fighters of the 54th Fighter Group stationed on Saaremaa at the Menüsti airfield. On one of the flights, a Giant delivered fuel and ammunition with a total mass of 37,500 pounds. Although overall the great payload capacity of the gliders remained largely unused, other units carried out only transport missions. The most intensively used were the gliders of the 22nd Squadron from the Orsha airfield in August 1941. The main cargo was fuel in barrels, which was transported to the Shatalovka airfield 93 miles from Orsha. To relieve the towing pilots from navigation duties, they already had enough concerns, leader aircraft were used. In October, during the battles to eliminate the Vyazma pocket, the Giants were used to supply fuel to the forward tank units of the Wehrmacht. Thus, on October 5th, Senior Sergeant Rem from the 22nd Squadron delivered 35,300 pounds of fuel to the Rudakovo area, 149 miles south of Orsha. About another flight, Rem recalls, "On October 11, 1941, we were tasked with delivering fuel to the tank units in the Vyazma-Bryansk area. The glider took off at 15:10 from Orsha South. My crew consisted of second pilot Lukash and load mechanic Baumann. We loaded 39,700 pounds of gasoline in barrels. The tow plane was commanded by Senior Lieutenant Stengel. We flew at an altitude of 6,500 to 9,800 feet. As we approached the landing site, in the pocket area, we were fired upon. We navigated by the large number of railway trains gathered in the designated area. We made a 180-degree turn and flew a few miles in search of a suitable field. At last we found one and landed. The machine began to shake on the bumps. We were back on the ground. Dugino Airfield, 168 miles northeast of Orsha. The dead were lying everywhere. As I recall, the glider had from 80 to 100 bullet holes, but not a single barrel of gasoline was damaged. The crew immediately got to work. We opened the cargo doors, untied the load, and began to pull out the barrels of fuel. Then infantry soldiers appeared, who had been watching our landing from cover. They helped unload the glider and move the barrels into shelter. Soviet troops fired frequently, and one shell exploded very close to us. A quarter of an hour after the shelling, an officer took me by all-terrain vehicle to the headquarters of the 6th Tank Division. At first, they did not believe that we had brought about 90 barrels of gasoline and 5 barrels of oil. They asked if we had made a mistake. Finally, they believed me after going to the shelter with the barrels. We returned to Orsha by a return aircraft. The glider had to be abandoned. The 4th Squadron in July 1941 from Vinnytsia and later from Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk carried out flights to supply the troops of Army Group South. In addition to gasoline and various supply items, bombs for dive bombers were transported. The 4th Squadron worked with less intensity than the 1st. Thus, the crew of Senior Sergeant Over carried out 3 supply flights to Kirovohrad and Mykolaiv on September 20th, October 2nd, and October 4th. The Giant units during this period suffered losses mainly due to bad weather and muddy airfields. In November 1941, they were withdrawn from the front. In the rear, the 4th and 22nd Squadrons were reorganized and the remaining squadrons disbanded. The Giants appeared at the front again in 1942. They operated in the Riga-Orsha sector, performing cargo flights. Towing was carried out only by Heinkel He-111 aircraft. Due to the small number of such aircraft, the number of sorties decreased, but the average load reached 44,000 to 48,000 pounds. The capabilities of the Me-321 were needed in supplying 6 divisions of the 16th Army, which in February were encircled in the Demyansk pocket, formed as a result of the offensive of the Northwestern Front. For more than 2 months, the Luftwaffe delivered the necessary supplies to this group of troops, which allowed it to hold out successfully until it was relieved. There were proposals to use the Me-321 in airborne assaults on Malta and in the Baku region, but these plans never came to fruition. At the end of 1942, to supply the 6th Army encircled at Stalingrad, a glider unit was included in the airborne squadron, armed with Me-321 and Heinkel He-111 tugs, as well as Go-242 gliders and Heinkel He-111 tugs. However, by the time this unit reached the forward base at Makivka, Soviet forces had already seized the last airfields of the 6th Army, and the Giants were unable to come to the aid of Paulus's soldiers. The unit was then transferred to Crimea. From the airfields at Bogorovo and Kirchhofor, The gliders transported various cargoes to supply German troops in the Kuban. To receive the Giants, airfields in Krasnodar, the stanitsas of Timashevsk and Slavyansk were used. Among the delivered cargo was even fodder for pack animals. On return flights, the gliders evacuated the wounded, up to 100 men on a single aircraft. In the spring of 1943, the heavy gliders were recalled to Germany. Later, they were concentrated in France and were no longer used in combat operations.